please do let me know. So I'm delighted to introduce Judith Suissa and Morea-Ghergu here. Now let me just quickly read their bios, because this is quite worth actually saying. It's going to be looking, Judith's the Professor of Philosophy of Education at UCL Institute of Education. Her research interests are in political and moral philosophy with a focus on anarchist theory, questions of social justice, radical libertarian education traditions, utopian theory, the role of the state in parent-child relationships. Her publications include Anarchism in Education, a philosophical perspective, and claims of parenting, reasons and responsibility in society. With Diana, before she enrolled in a BA in Education Studies at UCL's Institute of Education, Diana was part of the team of co-creators of the Alternative University, a Romanian educational experiment self-governed and self-organised by its learners. As the radical ethos of the Alternative University collapsed under pressure, she felt unable to decode. Diana decided to retreat for a while from the world of practice in order to explore and reflect on the utopias and dystopias in education. Now in her second year of studies, she's especially interested in power, authority, resistance and complicity in radical education. Can I leave it over to you tonight? Okay. So if you could give them a welcome, please do. Both on. Up's on, down's off for some reason.
Up's on.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to give a kind of overview of what I think of as anarchist education. A lot of this is historical, and a lot of it might be familiar to many of you, but because I don't know how many of you are familiar with the history, I'm going to kind of assume no familiarity at all. So apologies to those of you who've read a bit and know a bit about anarchist education. The historical context, I think, is important because obviously a central part of the anarchist tradition is the resistance and opposition to the state. But anarchist educational experiments have a kind of different relationship with the state and state education depending on different historical configurations of the state. So that, I think, is part of the issues that need to be teased out here. And I also want to draw some distinctions between anarchist, specifically anarchist educational ideas and practice, and broader radical or libertarian ideas, some of which overlapped historically. Okay, so I think the first thing I do want to say is that I don't think anarchist education, to the extent that there is such a thing, a distinct tradition, can be just defined as a kind of laissez-faire attitude to children, right? Just letting children do what they want. I think the history of anarchist experiments in education suggests something a lot more substantive and a lot more explicitly political than many other experimental educational practices and traditions, although there are overlaps, as I'll explore. So possibly the most famous example of an explicitly anarchist school is the Escuela Moderna in Barcelona, which was set up in 1904. Francesco Ferrer, who set it up, was involved in the anarchist movement, although he wasn't really a leading anarchist activist at the time that he ran the school. But he saw himself as a promoter of what he called rational education. Right? The idea was teaching children, as he put it, not what to think, but how to think. Right? So there was a lot of emphasis on a sort of non-coercive pedagogy, a challenge to traditional teacher-pupil authority. There were no grades or punishments or exams at the school. Right? There was a kind of informal pedagogical assessment, but he abolished all kind of formal forms of assessment and punishment. There was no compulsory attendance, which of course is a key feature of anarchist schools and some other libertarian schools that I'll look at in a while. So students were free to come and go as they want and to sort of organise their own timetables and their own kind of learning journeys. The school was particularly radical in that context because the education system in Spain at the time, in the early 20th century, was completely controlled by the Catholic Church in alliance with the state. So there was no secular education. So a feature of the school that was perhaps perceived as its most radical feature was that it was co-educational. Right? So obviously a lot of sort of radical features of anarchist schools in the early 20th century wouldn't appear so radical in other contexts, but at the time the school was seen as a huge threat to the dominant model of state education, which was heavily connected to sort of religious dogma, militarism, and nationalistic fervour. Now, what I think is important to emphasise is that there was, in spite of the emphasis on the lack of coercion and the lack of any formal structured timetable or system of grades and punishments, there was a substantive curriculum. Right? There were specific things and a clear ethos that the children were taught either through pedagogical engagement in the classroom or through the sort of general ethos of the school. And that was obviously a reflection of specifically anarchist values. Okay? So they were encouraged to value brotherhood, mutual aid, cooperation, international solidarity. Esperanto was taught at the school, for example, to reflect the kind of internationalism. They were explicitly given kind of anti-statist and anti-capitalist messages in the curriculum and in the sort of pedagogical interaction. The school was obviously under surveillance for its entire existence from the Spanish authorities, who were constantly looking for excuses to shut it down. And in 1906, they cooked up kind of false charge against Ferrer. I expect this story is familiar to most people who know about anarchist history. No, okay. Because Ferrer basically was charged with being involved in plotting an assassination attempt on the King of Spain. There was absolutely no evidence at all to convict him, but there was a sort of mock trial held. No one really was allowed to give evidence in his support. And he was convicted and sentenced to death by firing squad. And as the anarchist historian Paul Averidge has noted, it's probably because of his persecution and execution that Francesco Ferrer became such a kind of famous figure in the history of anarchist education. And in fact, his death sparked a worldwide movement of anarchist schools set up by anarchist activists and sympathisers across the world who identified with his kind of vision of libertarian education, rational education for children, and set up schools often carrying the same name and on the same model as the original modern school in Barcelona. So the most famous school was set up in the States and was called the Modern School, first in New York and then in Stelton, and lasted well into the 50s. But there were other schools on similar models established in South America, in Japan, several other places in Europe. And they shared the same kind of principles of non-coercive pedagogy, a rejection of kind of examinations, punishments, and so on. An emphasis on the idea of learning by doing, right? So the idea that children learn best when they are actively involved in engaging in practical activities rather than so-called book learning or traditional academic subjects, and an emphasis on cooperation and non-hierarchical forms of organisation. So the schools would often have, for example, a communal garden where children would experience growing their own food and learning about the production and sort of maintenance of the community. And often these schools would be part of intentional communities. And even if they weren't part of explicitly anarchist communities, they'd serve as sort of community centres for adult education, for political organising, and so on. So I think that the question I want to ask is, what makes these schools explicitly anarchist as opposed to just radical or alternative or libertarian? Education was very authoritarian and very kind of rigidly structured along gender lines, along all sorts of other lines. So one obvious way in which these schools were anarchist is that they rejected the state and they rejected the system of education that had been established by the state as a kind of universal compulsory system of state schooling. And this of course dates back to William Godwin's famous articulation of the objection to state education in 1793. He wrote, "The project of national education ought uniformly to be discouraged on account of its obvious alliance with national government." Okay, so anarchist educators were suspicious of state schools for the same reasons as they were suspicious of any state institutions, right? That the idea was that they would inevitably replicate the structures and hierarchies of the state, right? And that the schools would be used to sort of indoctrinate the children with statist ideology of one kind or another. Now, I think it's important to note that there is, of course, a much broader tradition of alternative radical educational experiments that exist outside the state system. But I think what makes the anarchist schools distinct is that what they're objecting to is not the particular practices that characterize state schooling in any given period or place, but rather the very fact that it is the state that's controlling the schools. Right? So it's an underlying political objection to the state as such that's at the heart of anarchist educational projects, rather than a different view of pedagogical relationships or curriculum. Having said that, there are, of course, overlaps between these anarchist schools that started probably in the late 19th century and more broader libertarian ideas of education. So the idea of learning by doing, for example, is something that you find very commonly in so-called progressive or child-centered ideas. It's associated with Dewey and the sort of broader progressive movement. But I think the difference is that for anarchists, the motivation for adopting these kind of pedagogical practices wasn't explicitly political motivation. Okay? They were driven by a vision of an alternative, non-statist political society. Right? What was encouraging them to take up these kind of different pedagogical approaches was not some kind of underlying theory of the holistic development of the child or a theory of how children learn better. It was an attempt to resist and break down particular political structures and hierarchies. And you see this perhaps most clearly in the idea of integral education, which is developed by Kropotkin most famously, and is reflected in anarchist education through the idea that children shouldn't learn in a way which prioritizes intellectual or academic work over manual or vocational work, that they should all be rolled into one. So children at anarchist schools would all learn a technical skill or a craft. There was a lot of emphasis on traditional crafts, also on artistic work, as well as more academic, sort of intellectual subjects. And the point of this for Kropotkin was to break down what anarchists saw as the pernicious distinction between what Kropotkin called brain work and manual work, because that was at the basis of the hierarchical socioeconomic divisions of the capitalist state. Right? So it was only by breaking down those distinctions that you could challenge the state and the state hierarchies. And that's, I think, very different from people who might promote a certain kind of practical learning because of some underlying idea about it being cognitively more effective to get children to learn through practicing a skill or a craft. Right? The motivation here was a political motivation, and it was explicitly political. The schools also reflected, I think, other anarchist ideas and principles. So the idea of prefigurative practice, which is, of course, an important part of the anarchist theories of social change. In a way, you can see the setting up of schools as part of that idea. So the school, most of these schools were attempting to kind of prefigure the alternative anarchist society, not just through their explicit curriculum, but through the daily practice and lived experience of the school, through the relationships that they attempt to enact, through the ethos of the school, through the relationship with the wider community, and so on. There's also, I think, a kind of reliance on what's often called the anarchist theory of spontaneous order. Okay? The idea that, as Colin Ward puts it, if you give people a common need, a collection of people will, kind of by trial and error and improvisation and experiment, eventually evolve some kind of natural order out of the situation. And this was very much at the heart of the pedagogical principles of these schools, that there wasn't any formal structure or system of rules, but the idea was that the children and teachers, as part of a kind of organic community, would evolve and create their own structures and rules, and these would be more robust than any externally produced ones. So, right, I've got like a third of the way through and I'm nearly running out of time. So, I think the point I want to make is that there are important overlaps between broadly libertarian ideas about education and the tradition of anarchist schools. But I think it's a mistake to conflate anarchist education with libertarian education, even though some people writing on the subject do conflate them, and even though, as I've said, there are important overlaps. I think what is distinct in the anarchist tradition is the explicit political agenda and motivation behind the pedagogical practice. And anarchist educators were under no illusions that it was possible to provide anything like a neutral education, right? So they completely rejected the idea that there could be such thing as a neutral education. In fact, they regarded that as a kind of piece of bourgeois hypocrisy, like as in Lenin's famous statement about that. So even though they might have been enthusiastic about libertarian ideas, they didn't mask the fact that they were trying through these practices to instill a particular set of values and political ideas. And this again is very different from other well-known educators within the libertarian tradition, notably A.S. Neal, the founder of Summerhill, who explicitly said that it was wrong for any adult to try and convey any substantive moral or political values to children. Right? He thought that the role of the educator was just to sort of step back and allow children to develop their own values. That was something that anarchist educators strongly rejected and saw as, in fact, an ideologically dangerous position because it would simply reinforce the status quo. So I think the anarchist commitment to education is part of a broader anarchist set of ideas about human nature. So one of the misconceptions about anarchism is that anarchists have a kind of naive, optimistic view of human nature. And I think the fact that so much anarchist theory and practice was devoted to education shows how wrong that is. Because what anarchists in fact hold, and David Moreland's written about this in his work, is a contextualist view of human nature. Right? That, in Bakunin's words, people have both the egoistic and sociable instincts in them. And which of those sets of instincts come to the fore will depend on the kind of social institutions that we create. So it was essential to create educational institutions that would nurture the altruistic sort of benevolent side. So that's a kind of historical overview. I mean, I'll just end with some tensions that I've been trying to explore in recent work, and I think Diana is going to pick up on some of it. So as you mentioned, I'm kind of quite interested in utopian theory, and I think there's some interesting tensions with utopian theory and anarchist theory. Certainly, there is a sense in which anarchist utopianism is a particular kind of utopianism, what some people would call a process utopia. But there's also been a lot of recent work on the idea of utopian pedagogy and what a utopian pedagogy would look like. And some people working on this idea, notably Darren Webb, who's a colleague at Sheffield, has argued that there's a kind of trend for thinking about utopianism in education that puts all the emphasis on process and experiment and just sort of playing around with ideas, whereas true sort of political utopianism has to have some kind of concrete substantive ideal, right? It can't just be about the process. And I think this raises interesting questions for anarchists, because there is a kind of there is a sense in which anarchist educators are working with a utopian vision, right? That is a kind of not fully worked out blueprint, but it is definitely a substantive vision of what an alternative stateless society would look like. But to the extent that schools and educational environments are supposed to kind of prefigure that alternative, then I think the utopian pedagogue is in a kind of uncomfortable position, because on the one hand there's this sort of idea that the utopian vision is sort of the embodiment of a hope for a different future, but on the other hand, if that future is something that's already been imagined by the adults creating the vision, then there's a question, I think, of the extent to which the children in the experiment are really part of some kind of utopian process, or whether they're just a kind of embodiment of adults' hope for a better future, which is of course a very central trope in a lot of mainstream sort of ideas about childhood and children as the embodiment of the future. So I think there's some tensions around there. And what I've been doing recently in some of my academic work is trying, perhaps a bit controversially, to draw on the work of Hannah Arendt, who has a very interesting, I think, way of thinking about authority in adult-child relationships, and to see if perhaps there's a way of theorizing this kind of tension as a productive tension, in the sense that I think what Arendt suggests is that teaching is a kind of attempt to teach, as she puts it, in the space between the present and the future. Right? So on the one hand, you're very aware of the responsibility you have as an educator towards the children in the present, in the moment here in the classroom, and the kind of needs that they have given the political reality they're inhabiting. And on the other hand, you are always sort of thinking about this alternative future and trying to get the children to imagine and hope for something radically different. And I'm what that liminal space looks like for an anarchist educator, and whether it's something that can be negotiated without collapsing into sort of internal tensions. So I'll leave it there and perhaps take up some other points in the rest of that. Pass over to you. Oh, you've got your own.
So what I understand is that Judith left us with the conclusion and the challenges.
Speak into the microphone. I can't hear very well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is it okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So the conclusion is that if radical educators want to counter the resigned acceptance there is no alternative, they must direct purposive action towards the realization of a utopian vision. So we kind of have to look at anarchist education and utopian education as having this goal and having purposeful action towards it. I fully support this conclusion. Yesterday I had an exam.
Use the microphone, or put another battery in that, because it sounds like it's failing.
In public policy and politics in education. And my main conclusion after studying is that the state has, or in a very authoritative manner, allocates values in order to direct change towards a specific desired future that is deemed desirable. But what I also discovered is that, in a way, this kind of leaves us without the ability to imagine alternatives. So that's why I really embraced Judith's conclusion that, yes, anarchist education should have a goal, should propose a vision, and must direct purposive action towards it. However, Judith also left us with two challenges for the utopian anarchist educator. The first one was that, in a way, anarchist educators have to, in a way, preserve the future as radically open, in a way, even though they propose a vision. And also to help, not only to help learners to develop their ability to, in a way, create that version of the future, but also to be able to understand and literally survive in the actual status quo. And I have two claims about the two challenges for the utopian anarchist educator, which are both inspired by my work with the alternative university back home in Romania. And the first claim would be that holding the future as radically open actually requires some sort of interplay between anarchist education, progressive education, and democratic education. And this in turn, what does is that it kind of puts educational experiments, radical or utopian education experiments on some sort of spectrum, and they just move on that spectrum. So I would argue that it's not as if we can think about educational experiences as having like a static position on the libertarian social anarchist spectrum, but rather moving constantly on that spectrum. And the second claim is that the fact that anarchist education has to attend in a way to the need of alternative of students, of learners, right?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I can't hear you very well.
Okay,
If you could speak a bit, stronger.
Stronger, okay. So what I was trying to say with the second claim is that because anarchist education has to attend to the need of learners to survive in the actual current status quo, this kind of opens some sort of opportunity for alternative and anarchist education to become complicit with the status quo.
What was the last word? Your voice went down. I couldn't hear the last word.
Complicity.
Pardon?
Complicity.
Complicit with the status quo.
Complicity with the status
Yes.
quo. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. So in order to argue for my first claim, what I will do is that I will look at the social change philosophy of the alternative university and also at Judith's discussion of anarchist, democratic and progressive education. The alternative university was created by a bunch of students, all part of the student movement in Romania, which were brought together by their rejection of three evils in education: standardization, the weakest one in my opinion, then indoctrination, and then control. And they created in the first phase a center of resources for student organizations, so people from student organizations could come at Cross, that was the first name, and in a way become more able, through sharing, more able to fight what was happening in their respective universities. But the fact is that Romania is not only capitalist state, an authoritative state, but it's also a very corrupt state. So after a while we kind of saw that we didn't really have a partner for dialogue, and we were like, okay, so we cannot change the system, then we will create our own system. So this is how the alternative university was born, and it can be argued that the alternative university is an anarchist experiment in education because it clearly rejected the state. So the vision was that by 2023, 1% of Romanian university students will be part of the alternative university campus, and they will create some sort of ecosystem of initiatives that were all driven by this rejection of standardization, control, and indoctrination. But I think the most important thing is that in a way we did what Kropotkin, who Judith cites in her amazing book.
Sorry, I couldn't hear that sentence.
Oh,
When
I'm
you're
so sorry.
laughing, I'm sorry. Please speak. I know I'm probably the only person here who can't
I
understand.
think your
I'm so
accent,
sorry. Okay.
if you can speak more slowly and a little bit loud.
Looking
Okay.
at us as well, rather than looking down.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
So what I was trying to say is that the second thing that made the alternative university an anarchist one is that it reconciled the two visions on human nature, so the egotistical potential in a way, and also the altruistic one. And it did so by, in a way, renouncing the Hobbesian world. What else? Then if you look at Escuela Moderna and in comparison with the alternative university, you can also trace anarchist characteristics. I will just mention some. So for example, Ferrer, in his school prospect, said that he will teach his students only the simple truth. He will not put any kind of dogma into their heads. He will not conceal from them any iota of fact. alternative university, we had a very, very similar quote guiding us by a Romanian philosopher who said that states of mind must be offered to others, no content, not advice, not teachings. Another thing that makes us similar to Scuola Moderna is the fact that we rejected credentialism. So in a way, we didn't offer any kind of diploma or certificates, things like that. And also, we had a very, very political curriculum in the sense that all the learning experiences were subscribed to one of the three things: imagining a better future, learning to build a better future, or actually building the better future. But also, the alternative university was very progressive because this question of compulsion, in a way, made us not only accept the freedom, not only accept that intellectual and personal freedom result from the content of the school curriculum, but also from an interplay between comfort, flow, and purpose. And this combination of comfort, flow, and purpose actually made our pedagogical approaches very, very progressive. So we had like sharing sessions where there was no guidance, no authoritative figure, and also the students had complete freedom to choose why they want to learn, how they want to learn, what they want to learn. So in a sense, it can be argued also that the alternative university was a democratic educational experience, as students were able to articulate the purposes of education and through practices such as democratic assemblies. So just to conclude this section, I think that anarchism, progressivism, and democratic education kind of converged into some sort of creative alliance to create this utopian educational experiment. I acknowledge that it might be the case because we are speaking about adult education, but as the progressive and democratic aspects of our learning environment put a much more emphasis on individualism, for example. At times, we moved from what Judith described as being anarchist education to a more libertarian one. But I really think that we didn't have a spectrum. And the second claim I made was that the need to help students survive in the actual status quo opened windows for complicity. And we were very, very preoccupied with survival in the alternative university. On the one hand, with the survival of the educational experiment per se, which means financial stability mainly, but also with the survival of our students, which was again very much linked to financial issues. So there, in a sense, there were some material necessities that we had to attend to. And when it comes to the alternative university, the material necessities were related to sponsorships. So in order for us to have, for example, the learning house, which was a space, we had to have sponsorships because otherwise students had to pay for the space. In the end, they ended up doing that, unfortunately. But also, we had to enter into some sort of cooperation with the private with private companies so that students would have jobs and so on. And that pushed the alternative university into a position in which it had to act kind of neutral towards capitalism. So while we hold it in a way a firm position towards the state, we kind of became neutral towards the private companies. But actually, as Judith said earlier, this neutrality was at times impossible, at times pure hypocrisy. And I think that the way we dealt with it was the worst possible way. Because of dependency on the private sector, we actually became complicit in a way, so we kind of changed our educational model and things just went down, you know. And unfortunately this year the alternative university will close because this kind of complicity is not, I mean, the people who are there, who believe in very, very different things, they cannot really propagate it further. So yeah, in a way it's a failure, but on the other hand it survived for 10 years, which is still good. So yeah, therefore I would say that there are some, when you look at material, the material reality and anarchist education, there is, I don't know, there appears to be a lot of complicity. So yeah, these were my two claims. And I think I have one which is actually my biggest personal struggle at the moment, is that I keep on thinking about our corrupt government, and I am just curious whether we are also complicit with the government, so besides the private companies, because we kind of turned our backs to the public sector in the way they did, even though for very different reasons. Yes, I also have this question. Thank you.
Do you want to pick up on anything first, Judith?
Sorry, I can't see.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think the question of complicity is an important one, and I think in the current climate here, I mean, I'm thinking more about children's education, and as Diana said, there is an important difference when you're talking about adult education. But I think in the current climate in the UK, there are similar dilemmas facing anarchist educators, because we see a sort of dismantling of the public education sector, right? That, I mean, we've you know, all the policy shifts in the last 10 years have been towards, you know, a move away from publicly provided, locally controlled schools with some kind of local democratic control, towards a much more kind of fractured and marketized system, and more sort of private sector, you know, entrance into the system as providers. And so I think anarchists are in a kind of a strange position, because on the one hand, you know, we've never been great defenders of the state as having a monopoly on education, but on the other hand, most of the attacks on the kind of political values that are at the core of the anarchist position are coming from the people who want to dismantle the public education system. So in many ways, the best way to support anarchist values is to align with defenders of publicly provided state education, whether it's through, you know, local democratic controlled school boards, so you know, or just traditional state comprehensive schools. That's where the real struggles are. And I suppose that's another element of the complicity that you were talking about, that on the one hand you're complicit with the state, but on the other hand you're defending the very kind of values that are much more likely to be eroded in privately provided forms of education, which is what we see in the Free Schools and Academies initiative, which is presented by the government as if it's a kind of grassroots community-based, you know, initiative that's allowing parents and communities greater freedom for education. But of course, it's nothing of the kind. It's an entirely top-down initiative. It goes hand in hand with very centralised forms of you know, assessment and so on. It's often very tightly linked with commercial interests and business. So, my view on this is that we should take what James C. Scott calls an anarchist squint. Sort of, you know, not necessarily think that everything to do with the state is bad and should be rejected, but rather look kind of askance at, where are the pockets of the kind of values that we would want to promote, whether it's within the state sector or perhaps even in private schools, in terms of, nurturing propensities for cooperation, mutual aid, challenging the capitalist hierarchies of the state, and so on. So I wouldn't necessarily say that, state education is evil and anything outside the state is good. But nor would I say that all schools that challenge the state are at all sympathetic to anarchist agendas. So, yeah, similar dilemmas, I guess. Yeah.
Do you got anything to pick up on that? Or? No? Would you like to throw it to the audience? I'll borrow one of your microphones. I mean, one of the things is that, I'm just delighted that William Goodman was actually mentioned early on, because not many anarchists know about him these days, but he actually only lived a few blocks away from here with his wife Mary Wollstonecraft and their daughter Mary Shelley. So I like linking anarchy to space itself, but I'm also interested in this idea about failing. You can look at things about failing, but it's actually what you can learn from those failures for what you're going to do next. Can anyone want to ask any questions or what have you? I'll give you the microphone. Go on.
You were talking about power, or you introduced some idea. You were going to talk about power. Sorry. When you started, you were going to talk about power. I'm not sure if you said what you wanted to say about power, because I was very interested. Because I'm interested in what I don't know you would call the psychology of power.
So I think there's an ambivalence around this in anarchist education that partly reflects the ambivalence within anarchist theories of social change and how an eventual anarchist community could constitute itself. So there is a worry that some form of coercion might be inevitable, right? That power relationships and power dynamics will evolve, and that there will have to be some kind of social sanction in order to preserve the kind of structures that anarchist communities want to have to sustain themselves, right? So there are worries there, I think, with adults about whether it's possible to create a kind of form of non-statist organisation in which power dynamics don't end up, leading to a kind of coercion of some people within the community, right? So I think the contemporary anarchist thinkers like Uri Gordon tend to theorise this more in terms of domination, relationships of domination, rather than just straightforward power, right? So the problem is with forms of power that are dominating, right? So the task for the anarchists then is to constantly be vigilant about where there might be relationships evolving that are dominating, and to constantly work to dismantle them or minimise them, but with the view that you're never going to be able to create a society completely free of domination. So I think that's the kind of anarchist view when it comes to adults, but I think there's an ambivalence when it comes to children, because some anarchist thinkers, certainly early 20th century anarchist thinkers, seem to share a kind of liberal paternalism when it comes to children, that they don't have any problem with adults exercising complete power over children, because there's a kind of assumption that children aren't fully formed rational or moral agents, and so it's not morally problematic to restrict their autonomy in the way that it is other adults. And I think that's not fully worked out in anarchism. I think a lot of, certainly late 19th century, early 20th century, anarchists didn't have a sort of conception of children's rights or children's autonomy or agency that would have challenged some of that. So power certainly, there were certainly power relationships within a lot of anarchist schools, and often also the worry is that when you have educational setups that do away with any kind of formal transparent structures of authority and rules, that actually can be more dangerous, because it then allows more power for particularly kind of charismatic, powerful personalities. And that is in fact what you sometimes find in these educational experiments, that everything seems to revolve around a particularly charismatic individual, head teacher or teacher, who actually has a lot more power over children, that kind of subtle psychological form of power, than you might have if you had some kind of transparent system of rules. But that's a worry, I think, in all alternative educational experiments. It's not something unique to anarchism. So I don't know if that...
I suppose I'm interested in why I mean, it makes sense that we grow up with parents. Most of us grow up with parents, and they're in charge, and we have that relationship. So it makes sense that there's an imbalance as children, but I'm curious why we carry on. Many of us as adults carry on with that power dynamic. You know, we can say, oh, it's about responsibility and things like that, but it seems to be, for many of us, very difficult to draw, to fully take responsibility for ourselves and not allow another person to have power over us. You know, and I don't know where, you know, yes, and I wonder, where that, whether what you're saying is that it really hasn't been addressed fully or thought out, because it's you know, I come into anarchism from that point of view, that it's a responsibility and a freedom, and we get freedom because we're responsible.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, of course,
and
this
then
is,
we negotiate with each individual.
Yeah. I mean, that's partly a psychological question, but,
yes, of course
but I don't think you can theorize that without looking at the social structures that enable certain relationships of power to become entrenched and to be replicated at all sorts of levels. I mean, and I think there are contemporary anarchist theorists who have combined a kind of Foucauldian analysis of power and how power operates with you know, sort of more classic anarchists' analysis of structures. So I think there is quite a lot of work on that. Yeah, it's not exactly the topic of it, but I agree with you that it's an important issue. Yeah.
Anyone else?
This may be a far too practical question to address anybody else, but I'm curious what the anarchist theorists would say about the parents' role in these education models, specifically with young children. What's their relationship with these schools, either when they're initially founded in the 19th century or more modern iterations today?
So this partly picks up on the earlier question. So a lot of the early anarchist schools, there was quite a lot of parent involvement. So certainly the schools that were situated as part of an anarchist community, like the American modern school movement, parents were often also teachers at the school, or they would come and work as, you know, facilitators, you know, providing certain kind of activities for the children, or you know, they'd be heavily involved in the running of the school. But Ferrer actually, Francisco Ferrer in Barcelona, when he set up the school, had a very strong view about teachers, and he thought that one of the problems with the mainstream school system was that teachers were just treated as kind of, you know, technicians within a top-down system, and he thought that teachers should have complete pedagogical authority in the school, which did kind of imply that the parents shouldn't have too much to say. Like, his view was, once a child is in a school, once they've kind of voluntarily agreed to enter into that space with a teacher, the teacher then is the authority, right, as long as they don't use their authority coercively. So again, I think they're different positions there. Certainly the later generation of anarchist educators, so people who continued the modern school movement in the States, there were some schools set up in the 60s and 70s that kind of became part of the deschooling movement. So they were, I think, more sympathetic to parents, and a lot of homeschooling parents also, I think, have kind of anarchist sympathies and would see what they're doing as part of a sort of anarchist ethos. And again, that's very different to A.S. Neal, who hated parents. I mean, he thought parents just ruined their children, right? And the whole point of having summer as a boarding school is to get kids away from their parents. So I think they're different positions within the tradition. But yeah, I don't think anarchists were hostile to parents, and it practically tended to be the case that the kind of parents who sent their kids to the anarchist schools were already sympathetic to, if not actually involved in, the anarchist movement. So there was a much closer alignment between the school and the community.
Do you have any thoughts, Dan? I forgot to turn it on myself now, that's great. Do you have any? No, this isn't working. Do you have any thoughts, Diana?
I'm sorry, on this particular question, not really, because I didn't look into parenting and anarchism. I'm not a parent myself, so I don't know from where to build a response.
This is, it works one minute and it doesn't. Okay, right, so down to someone microphone just now. Anyone else got any questions? Oh, all right, just chop it, pass it back first and then we'll come back to the front. Let's see about
Microphone? Okay, great. Do you think that a state could foster anarchist education? And also, if you were in charge of if you were the education minister or secretary or similar, what changes would you make? Do you need this microphone back?
Apparently.
So let's have another question at the same time, then you could combine the two. So who's Rose was the next one? Go on.
Is there any practical legacy of these anarchist schools?
Okay. Do you want to say something about the state?
So the question was whether or not the state can foster anarchist education, right? The first one. I don't think that it can, to be honest. I think it can foster some anarchist values, or just build on some anarchist values, but I don't think it can really build anarchist experiments in education. It will just contradict itself, at least the state as I know and I understand it now, like the capitalist authoritative state. What I think it is happening, and Judith already mentioned that, is that through the discourse of marketization, so building markets in education, in a way it's building diversity, some experiments, but I don't think that has anything to do with anarchist education, because it's driven by very different values. Yeah.
Yeah, on that question, I mean, foster, that kind of suggests an intentionality. So I don't think the state would intentionally foster anarchist values in schools, but I think it's quite possible for anarchist values to be fostered within a state system, less so now than it used to be, but there is a tradition in this country of radical democratic state education, and that was a lot more possible in the days before the national curriculum and before the sort of very centralised system of state schooling. So in the 60s and 70s there was quite a strong tradition of state schools, often also in very poor working class areas, where quite radical practices were sort of experimented with, and often practices that were, I think, very close to anarchist values. So for example, the famous example for democratic educators is Alex Bloom at St George's in the East, which was state secondary school in Hackney, I think, yeah, in East London. Yeah, made famous, of course, in this film To Sow With Love, right, where
God, yeah, that was a great film. Yeah.
where Ricky Braithwaite wrote a memoir of his time teaching at the school. But the head teacher of the school at the time, and this was in the 50s actually, had a lot more freedom to experiment and constructed his own curriculum, did away with sort of traditional forms of assessment and hierarchies, and very intentionally tried to foster an ethos of collaboration. He was very anti-competition and hierarchy, and you could see it as a kind of anarchist microcosm, really. I mean, there was a very strong role for students in democratic decision making. They had weekly meetings where students had a lot of input into how they wanted to construct the curriculums, and there were other schools like that in the 50s and 60s. I think they're rarer now, but I think it's possible within a state system. It's just less possible when you've got a state system that's so tightly kind of regimented with various sort of top-down forms of inspection and standardized tests and so on. But I know radical teachers working in the state sector who would see themselves as trying, maybe in very small ways, to engage in the kind of pedagogical practice which I think would be somewhat broadly anarchist. Yeah, and so Rosa's question was about the legacy of that. Yeah, I mean there are anarchist schools today. There's an anarchist school in Spain called Pedagogy, which is explicitly anarchist and follows through some of the same kind of ideas that you find in the earlier anarchist experiment. A lot of the alternative democratic schools of the 60s and 70s were actually quite close to anarchist schools. And David Gribble, I think, makes the point that schools stopped calling themselves anarchist schools because it was just, bad marketing, basically. But a lot of schools that would describe themselves as democratic schools were actually anarchist in spirit and in terms of the actual practice of the school. So, in England there were quite a lot of schools that were within that tradition, Sand School, Beacon Hill, places like that. There's a movement a sort of de-schooling movement in India at the moment called Shikshanta. That's a network of, they describe themselves as radical de-schoolers, but if you look at what they describe, how they describe what they're doing, it sounds fairly close to anarchism. And I think, although I've distinguished between anarchist schools and libertarian schools, I think some of the existing libertarian or democratic schools like Summerhill or Sudbury Valley do embody some anarchist practices. They just might not describe it as that. Yeah.
Now we've got someone at the back. I want to ask a question. I'm glad you mentioned the thing about people doing things commando style within the state system, because I certainly think that the school I went to was quite authoritarian, but there were certainly teachers within that were doing something very different. That was, I think, trying to encourage us to think for ourselves. And but I'm just going to pass it on to the audience and just that not all education happens within the school or the state system, and people learn from other environments as well. But anyway, let me just
Yeah, so this may be a comment or it might be a question, I'm not quite sure. I'm still interested in the role of the decision-making power of the parent and where they send their children to get educated. And I have a sneaky, you mentioned the business of taking anarchism out of the title of school because that would be marketing. I wonder if you were to do a survey of parents today, how much the word education and future earning of the child, future lifestyle of the child, is involved in their decision-making process, regardless of class or race. I wonder if you're in more working-class neighbourhoods suffering real poverty, how attracted they might be to a syllabus-free school where, getting to university or getting the 11, or getting the 11 plus, whatever it might be, to get on in life, things like that. So I suppose it's a question about expectations of parents, expectation of the child, regardless of the role of the state. The parent probably is someone who has to make a decision, and whether you think that decision-making process of the parent has changed over the years, because I have a feeling that it's about buying stuff, getting on in life. For lots of it's about children getting on up. I wonder how many libertarian thinking parents, let alone anarchist thinking parents, there are out there these days.
Before you answer that question, could you pass it on to Simon? Because did you have a question?
No.
No, sorry, misunderstood. Far away, and I'll try and find
No, I think that's a really important point. I think the context has changed significantly. I mean, just to focus on this country, but I think you could find similar shifts across other sort of Western, industrialized capitalist states. But the stakes are much higher, right? Because of the increasing sort of scarcity of jobs, the sort of disappearance of traditional working class jobs, the precarity that a lot of kids face in the current economic crisis, the sort of global labour market, all these kind of factors that you're familiar with, the stakes are much higher for parents who have to take decisions about their children's education, right? So, in the 50s and 60s, if you sent your kid to an experimental school where they might come out without any formal qualifications because they spent their time, exploring all sorts of creative ideas about democracy and so on, it wasn't a terrible risk because even if you left school at 16 with no qualifications in those days, you could probably fairly easily still find yourself, you know, a career route through to a decent working class job, right? Even if you came from a kind of community without the sort of social capital and stuff, right? There were jobs to get. There was on-the-job training. There were, you know, ways in which you could find a job that would enable you to live a sort of decent standard of life. And those jobs are gone, right? I mean, that's just a fact of the reality that we're facing. And so I think it is really important to note that, because the parents who can afford to take those risks, and they are risks these days, are much more likely to be parents who've got the economic and social capital, so that if their kids leave school with no qualifications, which does happen, you know, at Summerhill, for example, or other democratic schools, it's not the end of the world, because they'll be able to support them, and they might, you know a friend in the industry, right? So we know that that's how it works, and that is a real worry, and I think that context cannot be ignored. And I think parents who are kind of positioned as being very instrumental and practical, and, you know, just thinking about their children's future prospects and job earnings, shouldn't be dismissed, because those concerns are real, right? The worry now is not that your child will end up, you know, at a slightly lower socioeconomic position than you did. The worry now is that your child will end up with no financial security whatsoever, right? With joining the global precariat. And so I think that is the socioeconomic context in which we've got to think about the provision, which is another reason why I think it kind of makes sense to support publicly provided, you know, good state schooling at the moment, and especially locally controlled schooling, because this is part of the climate, and it's certain kids who are going to lose out in that system. And even with the free schools and academies, there's already research emerging showing how they reflect particular sort of socioeconomic makeup, and it's certain communities and certain parents who set up free schools. It's not, you know, at all devoid of hierarchy. So yeah, I think that's a really important point. I was going to say something else about that, but I've forgotten. Yeah, maybe I'll come back to it.
So now one microphone shot just now, so finally.
Hello. Yeah, my question is kind of about how it might be framed to sell it. Selling it seems ironic in the setting, but how it might be, how the idea of having anarchist education might be sort of made popular. And one way I was thinking of, so I work in mental health, particularly in the higher education sector. I think one thing that's quite interesting is we're seeing over time is that parents are becoming more interested in the idea that the university or schools support their children's mental health. And the research literature also shows that perfectionism has gone up extremely as examination has gone up. And a lot of parents and policymakers are waking up to that in quite a kind of non-pedagogical way. So it's quite focused on the support rather than the kind of preventative end of things. So I wondered if either of you had come across anything in the literature that kind of makes a link between mental health and well-being and anarchist education. And if not, might that framing be a way of appealing to current concerns?
Anybody else before I pass it on?
I'd like to address the first question. How can you sell it? So the year when we had the biggest number of people wanting to join the alternative university, so it was a year in 2013, I think we had 150 alternative students, was the year when we created the Changemaker Manifesto. And the Changemaker Manifesto is basically subscribed to the change-making discourse. And even though the manifesto itself, if you read it line by line, it screams anarchism, what happened is that in a way it was softened at the edges by being subscribed to this umbrella of change-making. And the second question related to mental health and anarchist education. So I'm not aware of, I cannot cite any kind of references, but I also mentioned in my bit that we kind of dealt with that by looking at three things. So one of them was the idea of comfort, the other was the idea of flow, and the third one, purpose. So, and they were basically all deriving either from anarchist or progressive education, but the trio, in a way, was kind of our take on what means well-being, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think well-being has become a bit of a buzzword in educational policy in this country, and I think that there's an irony in that what started off as a movement that might have seemed quite close to sort of anarchist or libertarian ideas, in that there was a concern that we were putting too much emphasis on children's academic performance and achievement, and that children were getting stressed by the constant pressure to succeed academically in the competition in schools, and too much testing and so on, and this was having a cost on children's mental health. That now seems to have shifted into a discourse where there's a pressure on schools to do well-being, right? Well-being has now just become another curriculum topic, and schools are now, Ofsted are going to introduce a kind of well-being indicator so that it's one of the things that schools are assessed on. And a further irony of it, I think, is that parents are now sold well-being programs on the grounds that it will improve their children's, maths GCSE. Right? So like, there's research showing that, schools that do these interventions where they have, transcendental meditation lessons once a week, or talk about mindfulness, that children do better in their GCSE. So the whole thing has become co-opted, I think, by the same kind of agenda that you'd think we'd be against. And I think anarchist educators, certainly at the more libertarian end of the spectrum, you do find a link made with happiness, flourishing, mental health, right? A.S. Neal made that link very explicitly. So there is an idea that the practice of freedom is a kind of therapy, right? That it is a route to individual emotional, psychological flourishing, that the experience and practice of freedom can lead to that. But that is certainly not the way, it's not the way that anarchist education, I think, is kind of presented as a political program, and it's also not the way in which well-being is kind of presented within mainstream educational discourse. So yeah, I'm not sure, and in fact, you even find this kind of relates back to the earlier question about how parents can be appealed to. You even find some radical democratic schools appealing to parents on the grounds that, research has shown that children who are taught within a much freer, democratically led environment actually perform better, and get into the good universities and so on. So it's very hard to move away from that kind of logic of, what are the end results? What is the academic achievement at the end of it? And I think a well-being agenda that didn't do that, but that was connected to a broader political vision, that's something that I don't see anywhere at the moment, actually.
Me again. I'm Canadian, just moved here a few years ago, from quite powerful backgrounds with all the privilege that comes along with that. And I think the debate sometimes amongst progressive parents who have that privilege to get to make that decision is, do they want to send their children to a school where they're surrounded by students who probably look like them, come from the same background, have the same privilege, where they're exposed to these very progressive ideals, or do they go to a public school, what we call public school, state school, where they'll be exposed to the breadth of society, and maybe those ideals take a back seat. And I think there's a tension there that, do you do what's best for society? Do you do what's best for your child? Is there a way to find confluence between those two questions? And I think that paralyzes a lot of people. I'm wondering if you've put any thought into that.
I'm going to get a lot of exercise
and
tonight.
I think,
Yeah, I think that's a tension that's been there for many years in the kind of alternative education movement, and precarious junior researchers who don't have full-time employment. So yeah, there are problems with that, obviously.
What about retired people?
Yeah, I mean, but retired people often are the people who doing that kind of work. But there's still an issue, I think, in the sense of, how you sustain a system that is reliant on unpaid labour within a broader structure of the state.
I think that this is one of the problems of actually I've gotten rid of the council housing. We're actually now got mortgage to death because people can't afford to take many of those chances anymore.
Right.
Because we were just speaking to Dave just before this talk started earlier on tonight. We were talking about radical experiments that were occurring elsewhere, but those were entirely contingent on having spaces where you could actually do things, and there's not many spaces in London where you can actually have the room to do those sorts of things. I mean, even getting this place anything in zone 1 to try and get a talk is absolutely extortionate prices. That's one of the things I've got to say. This talk programme has been given, space has been given for free by Housmans because they think that these sorts of talks are very important. So I've got to once again thank Housmans for the support they've given for this. Has anybody got any other questions or any thoughts or anything like that? How about one final thing I've got? Sorry, I really think you're looking at Taylor because you're thinking, what's he going to come up with? But what did you come up? I was listening to a talk on one of the lefty radio stations in the States last night, and Noam Chomsky was on. He came back to the example of that, even in an anarchist school, there has to be a certain, or in the most anarchist relationship with parents and children, there's still a type of authority there, because if the kid is running across the road, the parent's going to have to stop them from actually running in front of traffic or what have you. I know that's a nearly framed it begs its own answer, but if it gives you any thoughts or ideas.
Yeah, I don't think that is a problem for anarchists. I don't think anarchists are anti-authority. They're anti the kind of authority that derives itself from hierarchical top-down structural relationships. So functional authority is not a problem for anarchists. So we're all sitting here. If there was a fire and you were to say, everybody exit by that door, there's a fire, we would respect your authority and do what you said, and that would make that we wouldn't start challenging you on that. But so
I could imagine somebody doing it just for badness.
Right.
But here we go.
But I think the problem, what you need to look at in anarchism is the distinction between kinds of authority which are coercive and which are derived purely from someone's position within a hierarchy or an institutional structure, and functional authority which derives from an actual epistemic expertise or a functional role within a particular situation that of course can change. So as soon as that function is no longer necessary, then that person ceases to be an authority, which is not the case with forms of authority like the police, for example, which is by virtue of being in the police are an authority. So I don't think that in adult-child relationships there's necessarily any problem with them, although again you would have to distinguish between kind of authoritarian forms of parenting and the kind of benign use of parental authority to ensure that the child is protected from harm, and of course there are going to be grey areas there, so it's not a straightforward question, but I don't think that authority as such is a problem for anarchists.
I have to confess that if I was a parent, my greatest fear would be doing all the right things as an anarchist parent, doing everything right, and then ending up with a child who's a Tory. that really would be my nightmare scenario. It really would. But one example, just coming back to something that Judith was saying earlier on, I think there are. One classic example for me that occurred with about spontaneous order is that we were in the training course once, and during the 80s and 90s I was heavily involved in AIDS activism, and there's some fantastic trainers about, and it's a very sensitive and explosive topic because people are bringing all their taboos and fears into a training session, and you have to have the right people to actually do these things. And for some reason we had a fantastic trainer, and one day he fluffed up the training, and so someone else who was fairly new actually thought, I've actually got something that could actually say and actually add to this here, and she took over the session till the trainer actually was able to find his bearings back again. And I think that was just a wonderful example of that type of spontaneous order that can occur. And when she felt that she had everything that she had to say, she stood down again, and then the trainer herself was able to pick up from them and do it. And I've seen that in various examples, so don't be scared of them. Now, unless anybody else, has anybody got any final thoughts or anything else like this? Okay, it sounds like it's good. I've got to thank you both for an excellent evening. I think this is we have to do more stuff in educational game, and I'll try and find some people that are doing things like these alternative qualifications and what have you, because that would be interesting to bring those dimensions into the room as well. So can you give it up for Judith and Diana? Now, do keep an eye on the Housmans website, because we are going to do regular, all things being equal, we're going to do regular talks here on the final Thursday of every month. We're 99% certain it's going to be Professor Carol Levy from Goldsmiths is going to be doing a talk. It's just a couple of wee final details have got to be sorted out in that. We're going to have Peter Marshall. We'd already mentioned about William Goodman earlier on. Peter Marshall did a biography of William Goodman. He's going to be in June. We're going to have Martin Everett going to be talking. I don't know if people know Martin Everett, but he's a bit of an authority on Louise Michel, and he's going to have either an academic or a very someone else who's got specific interest in Louise Michel, and talking about some new research that's come out on her. So that should be very interesting. We've got David Goodman going to be doing a talk on what was that? I've actually done mental block. What was that article I did on Esther Leslie's dad? Carl. Oh, I've lost it. But there's actually once we get the website sorted out for this, it'll all be up there and then you can follow it. But in the meantime, keep an eye on the Housmans website. Look for the term Autonomy Now. There is an a very inactive Autonomy Now Twitter, but everything will be put on there. And again, final Thursdays a month, and thanks very much. Sorry about the batteries.